Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Indiana Jones and the National Journey of Innovation for Blended Learning. So, my name is Scott Ellis, and I'll be your guide for the next hour or so as we explore an exciting innovation that's happening across America in education. Over the last few years, we've really seen significant progress in the implementation of blended learning, but there's also a long way to go. There's a lot of work left to do, and there's a lot of exciting innovation happening, and those are the things we're going to explore together today. So as we get started, it would help me out, because I'd like to be able to customize this for you to make it as valuable as possible, is just to understand who we have in the room. Because with South by Southwest, obviously there's so many different types of folks attending. So how many folks are educators, teachers, principals, directors of blended learning? Okay, great. And how many folks are either consultants or folks working with software companies, people really providing support for educators? Okay. Do we have any state folks or federal policy folks? Great. And how about any funders or venture capitalists, other folks who really provide the resources? Great. And do we have any students? I wanted to check and see in case there are students at South by. And the second thing that would be helpful is just to understand the level of experience folks have with blended learning. So how many folks are implementing blended learning or have been working on this for the past couple of years? Okay. And for how many folks is blended learning a pretty new topic? Okay, some of both. Okay, so what we'll try to do today is I'm going to be providing some sort of big picture, high-level ideas as well as some specific innovations, so hopefully there'll be some pieces that are helpful for everyone. And the last very important question, I noticed that none of you are wearing your hats today, but how many Indiana Jones fans are there? Are there some? Okay. Because we'll see as we go through this, there are a few images from some of the scenes of Indiana Jones that I think have been really helpful metaphors for me in thinking about what is the journey of innovation like and what's required for blended learning? And so we'll talk about that. But I'm going to take my hat off because otherwise it's a little hard to see. I do have the whip up here in case later on people want to get a little demo. So just a little about me besides giving guided tours of Indiana Jones related events. So I'm a crossover from the private sector to education and nonprofits. So I worked at Hewlett-Packard for about 8 years and was also a business consultant, so experience in a big IT company. And a lot of that work was focused on data analysis and helping folks make better decisions, and then also on scale. So rolling out systems to thousands of employees or products to millions of customers. And so I've really brought a lot of those two areas of work to my current role. And I left that world almost a decade ago, and so I've been doing education and nonprofit stuff ever since. So I worked with an organization that does reading interventions for kids, roughly grades K-5. Worked for several years at New Teacher Center, so an organization helping to do mentoring programs for new teachers to help those educators get better. So I'm very passionate about educators and teachers. And then for the last several years, I've been working on blended learning. And then I've also got 2 kids. So my son is a 5th grader, so getting ready for middle school, and my daughter's a 9th grader, so making her way through the first part of high school. And I've just seen really up close and personal as a parent, so what does education look like today? What kind of challenges are they seeing? And to what extent is blended learning starting to be implemented in those classrooms as well? And then again, when I'm not dressed like this, the other thing that I do is I run a nonprofit called the Learning Accelerator. And so the Learning Accelerator is a little bit of an unusual organization. It's kind of a catalyst organization and an ecosystem coordinator for blended learning. So we are looking at what's happening in schools and in districts, but also partnering with other nonprofits, looking at software companies, talking with funders, and also folks at the state and national level. And so we really have this big picture view of the ecosystem for blended learning across the country and what's happening. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about today is the perspective of blended learning from that chair. The other thing I'll say about the Learning Accelerators, our mission is specifically to accelerate the implementation of high-quality blended learning in schools and districts around the country. So we don't sell anything and we don't deliver services to anyone. Our goal is to make sure that this happens for education across the country, and we really try and fill in any gaps that are needed. So in some places we're a funder, and so we fund new organizations or existing organizations to enable them to support districts. In some cases we're launching new organizations to fill gaps that exist, and sometimes we really coordinate the activities of other organizations. But again, it's really that ecosystem coordinator lens that we bring that I really want to share with you all to supplement the work you're doing either in classrooms or in your companies or in your states. So I'm very passionate about this. I talk fast. We've got a lot of content to go through. And I still have the theme song playing a little in my head. So let's get in. Let's get into this. We're going to have 2 perspectives for the conversation today. So the first half, I'm going to try and provide the high-level ecosystem view. And so again, something that you can sort of think about what's happening across the country. And then for the second part, we're going to dive into some specific examples of innovations, things that I think are happening now and are coming in the next couple of years that I think can be helpful as you think about what's happening with blended learning. And specifically by the end, I'd like to try and achieve 4 things. So the first is, I don't know how many of you know that you're actually on a national journey of innovation right now. You may not have been aware of that. So the first is just to make you aware of that and talk about it. The second is to share the national perspective, and so to think about what's happening with regard to ecosystem innovation across the country, what does the ecosystem look like, and what are the parts of it, and then what's the trajectory of this work? Where have we been over the last few years, and where are we going? The third is, again, to talk about some specific innovations that I see happening, primarily in the area of competency-based progression, and we'll talk about what that means. And then the last is just to come up with some specific steps that you can take as you leave this room to say, so now what might you do differently based on this information? The other thing that I want to try and do is to provide some clarity. So we've made tremendous progress over the last few years, but now it's getting complicated. We've got blended learning and personalized learning and competency-based learning and proficiency-based learning. We've got lots of models that schools and districts are implementing, lots of different companies trying to approach it in different ways. And one of the things I'd like to try and do is provide some specific perspectives. So for example, a very specific vision of what we mean by blended learning. Things like this that I think will help. Some of this may be a little bit provocative. I'm sure there'll be pieces that don't align with your experience or you may not agree with. And I think the goal is just to provide that clarity so either we can say, yes, we fully agree on these pieces, or if we don't, we know why we're not on the same page, and that helps push all of our thinking forward. But really what we're trying to search for in our work is that clarity, and I want to try and help provide some of that today as well. And the last bit of framing is we're talking about blended learning, enabling people to personalize learning and learn at their own pace. We are in a learning environment right now, and so I'd like to enable you all to do the same thing. So the first, you can see the link, the second line down, which is the link to the slides in this presentation. Just so you know, the third figure from the right is not a capital I, it's a small l. So I was working on this the other day and it kept coming up to some sports site. Okay, so it's a small l. But those are the slides that I'm showing here today. Please feel free to download those, to look ahead, to go at whatever speed works for you. Again, I want to make sure that you guys can customize the learning for yourselves. Next is, if you have questions, I'd like you to email them to info@Learning Accelerator. So this is just a central site for us, because when I think about this learning environment, it doesn't have to be constrained by these 60 minutes. And so if you all have questions that I can't answer, then I can answer them tomorrow, right? So we want people to learn at their own pace and to learn anywhere. Let's apply the same thing to the Q&A. And ideally, if we have time, my colleague Kira up in front here will be receiving your questions, and then we'll be going through and curating them, and so we'll put them up on the screen so we can all see them and hopefully work through them that way. But if we don't get a chance to get to them today, I'll send you an answer later this week. If we get lots of questions, then what we might do is release a blog with all the questions and all the answers for everyone. So the goal is really, how do we take advantage of technology to maximize the learning? And the last thing you can see, this is a screenshot of our homepage. Again, we're a funder and we've created a lot of resources. They're available for free on that homepage, resources for districts and resources for states. Feel free to check it out and again, browse through that and see what's helpful for you in pushing forward your own learning. But really just encourage you to take advantage of it. And if it works for you is to come along with me as we walk through this, then that's fine as well. I am going to take my jacket off now since nobody else dressed up for this because it's really hot up here. So I don't know how he did all these things going through these deserts and stuff, and he was always wearing his jacket. I mean, are you kidding me? And this isn't even that heavy of a jacket. And I don't even have hair, and so I don't know how he ever managed to do this. I'm sure he was melting. All right, so let's talk about the journey of innovation for blended learning. So a starting point is, what do we mean by blended learning? So lots of organizations have taken what I would describe as a big tent approach to blended learning. And we've done the same thing over the last several years. When we first started this work, no one in the country actually knew how many students had sufficient connectivity. Nobody even knew. A lot of schools were not even really comfortable using technology. And at that time, we weren't too worried about getting specific about exactly what blended learning meant. However, we're several years further on now, and we've decided that it's really helpful to start getting crisp about what we mean. So this is the Learning Accelerator's vision for blended learning. And when I'm talking about blended learning today, this is what I mean. The first is it's combining in-person instruction and learning with technology to achieve 3 things: the use of real-time data, personalization, and competency-based progression. All of these we envision as being required. So if we've got schools that are using real-time data and personalizing but are not competency-based, for us we'd say that's not the innovation we're looking for yet. Great to see the progress, but we're looking for all of them. So in-person learning is critical, right? Really the role of great teachers, absolutely essential and continues to be essential. And although their roles are changing, critically important. We want to make sure they're able to use the best tools to help supplement them. So combining with technology is critical. Use of real-time data. So we're seeing examples of classrooms where teachers are able to get data the same class period, sometimes half an hour later, sometimes 30 seconds later, and incorporating that data and changing the learning experience. So that's the first key piece, is having real-time data available and using it. Knowing this looks different for different subjects. If you've got K-5 math where it lends itself well to automated grading, you may get data instantaneously. If you're in high school with student creative writing, teacher probably is still going to need to grade that. It's going to take longer. But use of real-time data, critical. The second piece is personalization. So this is giving students choice in their learning. So how they learn content, and in some cases, which subjects or which topics they learn. So students can learn from a teacher through direct instruction, but they can also learn through an increasing variety of online and software programs. The key is that the students get to see what is that's most interesting to them so they can increase their engagement. And we also want to talk about teachers having different ways of reaching different students to help them be more effective as well. So personalization. And the last piece is competency-based progression, which is students moving forward at their own pace as they master content rather than just based on traditional time structures. And we'll talk a lot more about this later. This is tricky, and the tools and so forth are still being invented, but these are the pieces that we're looking for when we talk about blended learning. So let me tell you a story about a classroom that I went to last year, which first of all helped us as we thought about this definition and kind of this clarity, but also started us to really get excited about the potential for the future. So this is a classroom in Los Angeles, and it's a part of the city that's really economically challenged, so bars in a lot of the windows, barbed wire in a lot of the fences in the area. So it was a 5th grade classroom teaching English, and at this particular time, they were doing independent reading. So all the students had a tablet, and they weren't actually from that classroom, they're from the computer lab across the hall, but the teacher was able to use them pretty regularly. There was sufficient internet connectivity for every student to be able to use it seamlessly. And we all know it's not about technology, but the technology creates the context within which the teaching and learning can happen. So first thing we saw was personalization. So all the students are independently reading. There was one 5th grade boy who obviously was not very excited about being there. And I get that. My son is 10, and sometimes he's not thrilled to be doing what he's doing in school. But the student was trying to figure out what to read and was sitting with the teacher, and the teacher had, the program they were using was Lightsail in this case, had the list of reading options that were appropriate for his level, and they kept kind of flipping through them. And the student said, no, I don't want that one. How about this one? No, I don't want that one. And they kept going until finally the student said, all right, yeah, that one looks pretty good. I'll read that one. But the key is the choices were all appropriate for that student's level. There were many more choices than if they'd had the traditional boxes full of books in the back of the classroom, which they did. But there were many more options for the student to choose their own learning. And we saw the engagement where once the teacher walked away, the student was engaged in this book because he was involved in picking it. The second, competency-based progression. So we were talking with the teacher in the back of the class while the students were reading. He had a tablet, and on his tablet, with one click, he could show us, here are the learning levels of each of the students. So most of the students were either at grade level or slightly below. And then there were 2 students who were far advanced. And we could see this, he could see this information instantaneously. And also said, so the way I work with these kids is for these students who are really struggling, I work with them 5 days a week on independent reading. For these other 2, I only work with them twice a week. They've got it figured out, they're really moving forward, they need less support. And then the teacher also had in his classroom on the wall graphs sort of showing the student progress over time and really being able to customize the learning content for those students. And the last piece was real-time data. So while we were talking with the teacher, there were prompts that he had put up for the students, some of which were embedded in the software. So as students were reading, the software would ask them questions. The answers were popping up on the teacher's tablet as we were talking to him. And so all of a sudden he said, wait, hang on just a second, I've got a student who's off task who needs some support. So we walked away, went, helped the student, came back and just continued, no impact on the rest of the class, and the teacher was continually able to monitor this. And so these are the 3 things that we want: personalization, competency-based learning, real-time data being used. As we looked around the classroom, there were no barriers to national scale. There's no reason why any school in America couldn't implement these same solutions. And for us, that's what's exciting, is as we think about this vision for blended learning, So much of our role is to look and say, is there any reason any superintendent, principal, or teacher in the country who wants to do this can't do it? Our job is to eliminate those barriers. We're getting closer to a time when any school in the country can do this. So when we talk about the National Journey of Innovation, step one is, here's how we think about blended learning. The next piece is innovation. So innovation is exciting. It's how change happens. This is how we move forward, and it's something we want to model for our students and for our kids. Their world is changing. Innovation's a key part of their world. We want them to feel comfortable with it. And innovation is messy, right? Sometimes this is what it looks like. And one of the reasons we talk about a journey of innovation is because if you take a snapshot in time and say, how is this thing you're working on, it may look like that. But that's not the end of the story. And especially for something like blended learning, because there are lots of pieces that all have to work and have to be connected together. And some of them are being invented now, some of them have already been put in place, and some of them we haven't started working on yet. We need to think about the journey of innovation so that we are continuing to invent the pieces that need to be developed. We're continuing to implement as we go, but recognizing that while innovation is exciting, it's also challenging and it's messy, and we need people who are recognizing that and willing to jump in anyway. And so this is a place where, from the very beginnings of this work, there was an image from one of the Indiana Jones movies that was really helpful for me in thinking about what does innovation look like, and particularly thinking about for those schools and districts, especially over the last few years, but even today, who are really trying to jump in and implement blended learning. What does it feel like? So this is from the third movie, so I think many of you will recognize this, from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. He's on his quest for the Holy Grail, right? This famous religious relic. He's been over all kinds of barriers and all these challenges. He's almost there, and then he runs into this deep gorge, which is too wide for him to jump across. There's no bridge across. There's no way to go around it, so he's got to decide what to do. And so what he decides to do is to take the leap of faith. So from my first days of doing this work, when I think about schools that have been trying to implement blended learning, especially 3 years ago, when we didn't even know how much connectivity anyone in the country had because no one had gathered the data, I would think that as a superintendent or a teacher, it feels a lot like that to try and start on this journey. A big part of our goal, I think, is over time to make it easier, because we are figuring things out now. People don't need to figure out how much connectivity do you need and where do you get it. We have those things answered. We have resources that have been established for teachers to help them thrive in these classrooms so their students can thrive that didn't exist a few years ago. So now the step is not as scary. The leap of faith is not as scary, but there is still a recognition for all of us that we are figuring some of these pieces out. And as we think about the journey of innovation for blended learning, a lot of it's about recognizing that that leap of faith is a key part, and then to make the leap of faith easier and less risky over time. So this is what I would describe as the roadmap. When we say, what does the National Journey of Innovation for Blended Learning look like? We're trying to help accelerate multiple transformations in industries at the same time. But there are 3 key steps in helping us get from the current state to a future state where you've got blended learning for all 50 million students in America. The first piece is cultivating the enablers for scale. So as we think about schools around the country, there's a series of things that every school needs to do to implement blended learning. You have to have enough connectivity, enough devices, support for your teachers, have to have communications plans to talk to your communities, your parents, et cetera. You have to understand how much it costs and a number of other pieces. We need to get those in place so that any school in the country can access those and be set up for success. This has been the bulk of the work of the last several years, and I think we've made a lot of progress. And we'll take a look in more detail in just a second. The next step is clarifying exactly how the teaching and learning change. So increasingly, we're talking to schools that say, yeah, I've got my connectivity, I've got my devices, my teachers are ready to go. What exactly do I do? And the way I think about this is, how do the student, the teacher, the software, and the data interact in the classroom so we actually get the personalized learning, the competency-based progression, and the real-time data? Or another way of thinking about this is, it's Tuesday at 2 o'clock in my 4th grade math class, and I'm the teacher walking in front of 30 students. What exactly do I do? And what I've seen in presentations over the last several months and years now is you can see pictures of the classrooms, and people can show how they've moved the desks around, and they can talk about some of these other pieces, But then there's a little bit of hand waving when you get to, well, so how exactly does the data about student mastery get captured, and where does that live, and exactly which software system do I use? I think this is the next area of our work, which is to make this crystal clear so any educator can replicate it. And then the last piece, and the work largely ahead of us, is to measure the impact and drive adoption. So once you've got the enablers for scale in place, and you know exactly how teaching and learning changes in the classroom, then we need to continue to measure and get better data about whether it works for teachers and kids, and then we need to make sure everyone's aware of it so they can start using it. So I think these are the 3 key steps in the national journey for innovation. And as you think about the work you're doing in your classrooms, in your schools, or in your companies, I think it's within this bigger national picture. So we'll talk a little bit more about each of these. For the enablers for scale, again, as I said, the key thing is what are all the things that every school in the country would need to have in place in order for this to be possible? And so this is the way we think about keeping track of this work. Each of the rows you can see is one of these areas, right? The school's got to have strategy and design, connectivity, devices, software. I talked about finance, communications, et cetera, all the things that they need to be able to implement this. And then for each one of these, the lens that we've used is, first we've got to define the issue. Can any school in the country do it today? If not, why not, and what are the barriers? And then we've got to determine the path forward. So do we need new organizations that don't exist? Do some of the organizations that exist today need to be scaled? Do they need to be coordinated together? Then we've got to catalyze the change, and sometimes it's providing the funding, sometimes it's working with the organizations to create the resources, and then the last is really trying to achieve impact at scale. And so I think a picture like this is what we're thinking about to say, how are we doing? I think we've made a lot of progress in cultivating the enablers for scale, right? We've got an additional $4 billion a year for connectivity. We've got resources for teachers that exist on our website and on many others that are all free. We've got videos of teachers in blended learning classrooms. So there's more work to do here, but I'd say we've made a lot of progress in the enablers for scale over the last few years, and a key step for the next couple of years is to continue and really finish this work. The next piece is then clarifying how teaching and learning happens in the classroom. I think this work is really just starting. We've had case studies and examples of schools that are doing blended, and I think those have been great to get the ecosystem going. But as we get more specific about what we mean by blended learning, we need more precise examples, and they need to get to the level of detail where they really can be replicated by teachers around the country. So the work that we're starting, and I think this is what more organizations will start doing as well, is to identify a bunch of schools that either they tell us that they're doing what we're talking about in terms of all the pieces that we think are required, or others have pointed us to them. We conducted diligence with them, interviewed them, ended up visiting over 20 schools, over 100 classrooms to see what exactly are you doing. And I think there are 3 deliverables from this work. The first we call the building blocks. So when we talk about real-time data, personalization, competency-based progression, to be able to show precise examples of exactly how schools are doing this, and key success factors, how to make it happen, key challenges, so any school in the country can copy this. The second is then to show what we call models at work. So it's great to understand real-time data or understand personalization, but what's really helpful for educators is to see, here's an actual context where all of this is happening. How does it all come together? And again, those need to be specific enough that our metric is any educator could see that example and then say, I know what to do and I can go do it. Right? No questions, no hand waving, really understand whether, how to make that happen. And then the last piece is what we call ecosystem problem solving. As we do this, we are going to run into more questions we haven't solved and we don't know the answer to. And so a big part of our goal is to help move the whole ecosystem forward by putting those questions out to our colleagues so we can help figure out together how do these things work. So for example, in competency-based learning, we may talk about not having traditional GPAs, not having traditional letter grades. In today's world, we have GPAs, we have traditional report cards. What do we do in the interim? How does this work? We've got questions like that and others that we'll discover by diving into this work more that we need to work on together. And I think this is where a lot of the work of the ecosystem over the next 2 years needs to be focused, is really clarifying this piece. And then the last step, and again, we've started on some of this, but there's much more to do, is to measure the impact and drive the adoption. So we actually already know a lot about personalization and how it helps and why and in what conditions, but we need much stronger evidence and we need more specific evidence. And as we get more examples of exactly the type of implementation we're talking about, then we can start measuring those examples and saying, does this kind of implementation work? And the cycle we really think about, again, is a relatively traditional one in measurement where you've got generation of the knowledge. So we're seeing what do we know about what works, and then disseminating that, so researchers sharing that information with educators around the country so they can use that in their implementations. Educators seeing, so are there new skills that we need to acquire or new approaches we need so we can actually implement this? And then they apply it. And so we start seeing more and more examples of implementation, which then in turn researchers can continue to measure. And so as we get more examples and we're getting clear about what we mean, more folks implement, we'll get more evidence, and that evidence can then help us continue to move the sector forward. So I think, again, we've got a big base of knowledge to start from. We need to get more specific and clearer, and this kind of cycle really needs to continue. And I think this is work, again, that's starting now. There was just a meeting a couple weeks ago of a lot of organizations doing measurement in this space. This is a key part of what's going to be needed in the years ahead. So that's the high-level view. So we are on a national journey of innovation to implement blended learning. There are the key pieces around cultivating the enablers for scale, where we've made a lot of progress, clarifying how the teaching and learning happen, which is really the next set of work ahead of us, and then measurement and driving adoption. So now let's shift gears and let's talk about some examples of innovation and dive into some of the specifics. So when I think about the vision for blended learning, I think the key focus for this work over the next couple of years is going to be on competency-based progression. And so it's been amazing how much this has changed just in the last 6 to 12 months, and how many people are talking about competency and really focusing on this, and how sophisticated the conversations with educators have become. I went to an event a few months ago, and whereas I'd say a year and a half ago or maybe 2 years ago, the whole idea of competency-based learning was very new, the educators were saying, no, we know a lot about that. How exactly are you doing X? What tool are you using, right? So we're getting more sophisticated, but I think this is where the innovation is going to be for this sector for the next 2 years, is really this focus on competency-based progression and how to actually make it happen. So I'd like to talk through 4 innovations in this space. So these are things that we're thinking about, we're seeing others working on as well, that I think will be really important in the next couple of years. The first is really increasing clarity about the required elements of competency-based progression. So if you want your students to move forward at their own pace as they master content, what do you need to have in place to make that possible? The second is some examples of data structures and dashboards. So a big question that folks are running into is, so what tools do I use and how do I manage the data? And so we'll talk about that. A third is clarity about the market structure itself. And I think particularly as we look at this whole space, there are parts of it where I think sort of typical perfect competition among companies is going to be the key driving force. But I think there are parts of this market that look a lot more like utilities, and there could be benefits for thinking about structures in that way. And then the last piece is really working on the market disconnect. So I think there's an opportunity to think about what we're calling open learning objectives as a way to really help align the conversation between educators and companies. And so let's look at each one of these. So first is the elements of competency-based learning. And so I think Susan Patrick and her team at iNACOL and Chris Sturgis with Competency Works and others have done a lot of great work over the last several years to continue to push the field forward on this. And I think importantly, we've got to recognize that they did so much of that work over the last several years when we didn't have the tools and the data that we have now. So the market's really moving forward. What we've been thinking about a lot is what is it that's actually required, almost from a logical standpoint? If you actually want kids to move forward, what must be true in order for that to be possible? And so the concerns that I have and these issues that we're talking about here is I think there's some areas where we haven't been as clear as I think we need to be, and I think we can really make progress in the months and years ahead by focusing more on these. The first is the learning objectives themselves. What do we want students to know or be able to do? And I think my big worry here is if we really want to be in a world where students move forward as they master content, it starts to look more binary because either the student's moving forward or they're not. And so we've really got to be crystal clear about what do we want those students to know or be able to do. I think the learning objectives have to be specific. So you can't say, hey, we want kids to be able to multiply, because that could be a lot of things. You're going to say they've got to be able to multiply 2 one-digit numbers or something where it's specific enough where we could say, we know what that means and we know how we might assess that. They've got to be discrete. So a lot of the learning objectives have multiple pieces. One of the 4th grade ELA standards from Common Core, just as an example, says that the students need to be able to identify the theme of a story, poem, or drama and summarize the text. Well, that's actually 6 different objectives. And there's also an or in there, which means that technically I don't even need to teach poetry. So I think we need to really push our thinking to be specific about what are the learning objectives, and then they've got to be demonstrable. So if we want to enable students to move forward at their own pace, we need to know, have they actually demonstrated mastery? And so I think this is an area where we're thinking a lot about how do we push for clarity of the learning objectives, because I think they're the foundation for a lot of competency-based learning. The second is the mastery threshold. So what does a student need to do in order to demonstrate mastery so that they can move on? And again, I think whereas in the past we've been able to say, that student did well enough, we give them a B or a B minus, but they can still move on to the next topic. We may be moving more to a world where you say, so is the student ready to move on or not? And I can't just give them a C in the same way. I've got to decide whether they're ready to move on. We've got to be really clear about the mastery threshold. The third is the students have to have a process for demonstrating mastery. So what does the student do? Are they trying to solve problems? Do they need to write an essay? Are they doing a particular project? But we need to be clear what that process is, and it has to be scalable so that the student can do it for every learning objective, right? They've got to be able to do it for all the things that they're working on. And then we also need a process for teachers to assess mastery. So if the teacher needs to know, has the student mastered this, they need to be able to know what that process is. And they may be able to use automated grading, again, for maybe elementary math. Maybe they don't even need to do any grading themselves. They just look at the results. Whereas for high school physics, they may be actually looking at student projects that demonstrate how momentum works. We've got to know how are they going to assess. One of the challenges we've run into is, what if a student has to do a big project and they do their project and they don't succeed? So does that mean they have to do the whole project again? And then the teacher says, but wait a minute, I'm already grading 35 of these projects once. Do I have to grade them again for every single student who doesn't demonstrate mastery? We need to figure that out because we need a scalable process for students to demonstrate mastery. And then the last is the data about student mastery. What does it look like? Where does it live? How does it get managed? And I think this is an area where there's a lot of innovation happening. But I think what we've got to be clear about is what are the elements of competency-based learning and how do they work? And then there are other elements that people are definitely talking about. How do we make sure that when students demonstrate mastery, it's a positive learning experience? How do we make sure personalized learning is linked to this? So once you're clear about these elements for competency-based learning, students get personalized learning experiences. And I think these are also key pieces. I just really worry that without being crystal clear about these 5 pieces, it's not even possible to enable students to move forward at their own pace. So this is the first area where I think innovation continues to be needed, which is to keep pushing the thinking on what the key elements of competency-based learning are. Do I need to pause a second? I want to make sure everybody's got photos of the slide that needs it. And remember, you can download the slides. We've got the link over there on the chart. The next is looking at the data and the data structures. And so I'm going to show an example of a dashboard and what this might look like. But again, the starting point is the learning objectives. And so we'll show you a dashboard in a second, but here is what a set of learning objectives might look like for elementary school math. So specifically, we're talking about multiplication in this case. And so we can go through the standards and see what do we mean when we say students need to be able to multiply. So multiplying 2 one-digit numbers, and then a 2-digit number times a 1-digit number, and then a 4-digit number times a 1-digit number. And for each one, you'll see we've got a mastery threshold. So in this case, we say solving problems is a feasible way for a student to demonstrate mastery. How many problems do they have to solve accurately in order to demonstrate mastery? So some kind of level of clarity like this is a starting point. So this is an example of a dashboard, and this comes from a free system called Mastery Track, but I think there are a lot of other systems that people are developing that be able to capture and present this data. But being able to see, with the click of a button, where are students in their learning? So in this case, you can see across the top, the 1.1, 1.2, those are the learning objectives I just showed you. So these are the things we want the kids to learn. And then every row is a student. And the green circle with a check means the student has mastered that learning objective and is ready to move on. The gray circle with the little circle inside of it, the little clock inside, means they just haven't gotten there yet, right? There are a couple students you can see who actually haven't gotten into the system yet. The purple circle with the X means that the student tried to demonstrate mastery, but they did not succeed. And again, in a competency-based world, there's no such thing as failure. They just haven't mastered it yet. And so they need to kind of try again. They need to get some support from their teacher. And then the blue circle with the arrow means that assessment has been released to the student and they're ready to try and demonstrate mastery. So some kind of a dashboard like this, where a teacher has the information about student mastery at a point in time, I think is a key part of innovation for this sector. But in this case, the first dashboard is from October 15th. Now we can look at the same dashboard for the same students 2 weeks later. And what this enables us to see is, what learning has happened over time. And so I think increasingly getting to a point where we can not only see where students are in their learning, but progressively over time can see learning progress happen, understanding that kids don't all move at the same pace. So in this case, right, the teacher was using this one a little bit more at the beginning of the year, kind of to baseline where everybody was. So the first student we saw only had mastered 2 objectives on October 15th. 2 weeks later, they'd mastered 3 more. The second student, student B, tried to master the first 2 but did not succeed. But now 2 weeks later, they had actually learned those and moved forward and solved another one. But then they tried the next 2 objectives and did not pass. But being able to have the teacher have this information at their fingertips so that they can then decide, how do we intervene to help each student move forward at their own pace? This is an area where I think what's very exciting is more and more companies are thinking about this problem and are creating solutions that work for schools in this area. But I think in order for competency-based learning to really happen, eventually what teachers are going to need is the data and tools that makes their lives easy so they can actually make this real. And so this is a key area of innovation where we talk about data structures and tools to enable this to happen. So the third piece is, now talk a little bit bigger picture, is to think about the structure of the market overall. So when we think about the landscape for competency-based learning, I think there are parts that lend themselves very well to traditional competition so we can drive innovation, but I think there are others that are somewhat different. And as I've been talking with colleagues about this and thinking about it, it's been helpful to have some analogs or examples. And so what I've been thinking about is the market for lamps. So if we think about this for a second, there are lots of different types of lamps, right? We've got tall ones, short ones, ones that have hinges, the cool lava lamps, different colors. And we need ongoing innovation, right? There are different customer needs, different value propositions. And so that's a place where it makes sense for companies to be competing for your business. And the fuel for that innovation is customer purchases, right? Companies or individuals are buying lamps, and those dollars are what drive the return on investment for venture capitalists and for startups and for profits. And so it makes a lot of sense for that to be a place where you've got innovation driven by competition. However, all these lamps need electricity. And this is something where there's not a lot of ongoing innovation at the same level, and it makes sense for all of the lamps to get electricity once. And it's valuable for customers because when we buy a lamp, we know that we can just plug it in. And so the structure for the electricity is very different than the structure for the lamps. And so as I think about competency-based education, I think there's a lot of parallel. Because as we think about and I'm going to walk over, or I'm going to point just a little bit. If we think about the structure for competency-based education, on the top left, I talked through the required elements, the learning objectives, the mastery thresholds, and so forth. A lot of these are areas where they are not changing frequently. So there's not the same level of need for ongoing innovation. Because as the learning objectives are defined, I mean, yes, we're going to figure out whether we have a 9th planet or not and what it's called. I just read the other day that we found a brand new species of octopus. So there is progressive learning happening. When that happens, we add new learning objectives. But otherwise, the multiplication objectives I showed you are not different than the ones that I had when I was a kid or that my parents had. And so those are areas where we don't need a lot of ongoing innovation. There are significant benefits of standardization. Right? So I was in a classroom again a few months ago where the teacher was breaking down the learning objectives with their students. And I asked the teacher, so are you sharing what you're doing now with the English teacher right next door? And her answer was no, let alone all the other teachers around the country who are also breaking down the same learning objectives. So if there's an opportunity where we can actually provide those learning objectives to more educators and can save them that time, there's also the opportunity to share promising practices. So as we've got more clarity and agreement about what the learning objectives are, teachers can learn from each other. And I think there's a potential for pooling the analytics as well, where if people are talking about the same learning objectives, the same mastery thresholds, you've got common data that can be used to compare them. I think it's more feasible to standardize in some of these areas, and therefore we should make these as inexpensive as possible. Right? So the goal should be to align the price that customers have to pay with the cost. And if this is an area where not a lot is changing, it can really be inexpensive for educators. On the other hand, if we look at the bottom left and look at the learning solutions, so how actually do we help kids learn how to multiply? The advanced analytics, so I think more and more companies are looking at what data do we have about student mastery and how do we use that data to make better decisions, and then also just the ongoing services and consulting. So districts need help implementing blended learning and support, and this is the kind of work that districts should pay for. These are areas that I think are, I would call them more custom elements, more typical, where we have a need for ongoing innovation. The fuel for that innovation should be districts paying for that work, which is, again, going to provide the return on investment for your VCs, et cetera. So these are significant elements where you need ongoing innovation, where there's a lot of customization required. So different types of innovations are going to work better for different kids in different schools. We need the market to keep competing to create the best solutions. And so I think as we think about competency-based education and how all these solutions are going to be provided, I think it's valuable to think about the idea of having some of them be traditional perfect competition areas that drives innovation, and some that are more like utilities. And the real question is, can we actually create some of these standard elements, and can we make them available for schools and districts in a way that's much less expensive? And then the last piece, in some ways I think about this as a little bit more speculative, which is to think about how do we think about the market disconnect between educators and companies that are providing services. So as I'm talking to teachers around the country, and they say, we're looking for learning solutions for our kids to help them figure out how to deal with improper fractions, for example. But they say either, gosh, it's really hard because there's so much content out there and it's hard for me to search, or I can find stuff for fractions in general and some sort of kind of computations, but it's really hard for me to find exactly what I'm looking for. And so what I think about is that educators they're out there looking for specific things. They're looking for blue, and they're looking for red, and they're looking for yellow. And vendors are offering stuff that's close to it, but not quite. So they're kind of offering magenta and orange and aqua. So it's definitely similar kinds of things, but either not exactly what they're looking for, or maybe it's all bundled together in a way that they don't want, or they don't want the entire curriculum. And so really grappling a little bit with how do we make sure we can try and get what we want? And so a lot of what I've been thinking about is how do we deal with this market disconnect? I think the path through this really needs to be through the learning objectives themselves, and continuing to get clear about what is it we want students to know or be able to do, and then making sure that educators and vendors are talking the same language. So the more we can get to a place where educators are saying, I'm looking for a solution to help my students be able to multiply two-digit number times a multiple of 10 and figure out what to do with that 0. And then companies saying, we've got solutions for that particular learning objective. Now educators and companies can talk to each other about the same type of solution. And now it's really just a discussion of who's got better and cooler ways of doing that, and then aligning on price. And so I think this is the kind of structure for the market that I think is needed. We've been thinking about whether you can actually make these open utilities. So we've worked on, for example, learning objectives for K-5 math. And we have what we call open learning objectives that exist. They're on GitHub right now, where any teacher in the country could see these learning objectives that are all written specifically to enable competency-based learning. So I talked about specific, discrete, demonstrable learning objectives. So those all exist. But the more we get educators and companies thinking about these objectives in the same way, I think we have a chance of getting to a place where you don't have a market where one group is looking for red and yellow and blue, and the others are offering magenta and orange, but really actually getting much more alignment. The other way I think about this is it's the learning objectives provide the skeleton for the market. And if we have the same skeleton, all the different pieces can kind of hang off that together. The muscles can all hang off it together. But if we've got a structure where, from the beginning, we're talking about different things, it's very difficult to fix that disconnect. And so when I think about competency-based education, the last area of innovation I think about is, can we address this market disconnect? And could open learning objectives be a path to get there? So let's circle back a little bit. From the beginning, what we want to talk about is first to be aware that there is a national journey of innovation for blended learning. I think it's been happening over the last several years. We've made a lot of progress in a lot of areas. More and more schools have what they need to get going. There's more work to be done, especially on the enablers for scale. And then the next phase really is clarifying how the teaching and learning change, and then getting ready to measure and drive adoption. I think the national perspective for this really thinks about how much innovation is happening overall and where is it happening, and then also thinking about the continuing maturity of the ecosystem. We've talked about some of the innovations, particularly around competency-based learning. And I think it's really exciting as you walk through, obviously the exhibit hall downstairs, but seeing more and more companies that are pushing products that are getting further in providing dashboards, giving an approach for competency-based learning. What I'm really thinking about is how do we get to a place where that information can be leveraged more effectively across the companies rather than all of them individual proprietary solutions, and also understanding that for the innovation to happen, we need companies to really be pushing this forward, and we need educators to be looking for these solutions And in many cases, this is what they should be using their scarce resources on, is providing fuel for that innovation. So let's talk about some specific steps. So given this picture, as you go back to your individual classroom, your school, your company, what might you do? What are the implications from the national journey of innovation? So this is where I'll come back to Indiana. And this is the scene which is from the same one that I showed at the beginning. So remember, he takes the leap of faith, figuring out how he's going to get across the gorge. However, he didn't get across to the other side and then just keep going. He did something else first. So take a look and see what Indiana does when he gets to the other side once he's taken the leap of faith. Okay, so when he gets across, and he finally makes his first steps, he's amazed that he doesn't fall. He walks all the way across. He sees that he made it, but before he moves on, he stops, reaches down, picks up the rocks, and then throws it back across the bridge so the people that come behind him can see the bridge, right? The key is to make it easier for people who come behind, because innovation's scary, taking the leap of faith is risky and challenging. If we make every educator in the country take the same leap of faith, many of them won't, right? It'll be a barrier that'll prevent us from making that progress. However, if, as we're innovating, we stop, we pick up the rocks, and we throw them back so people can see the path, then I think we've got not a bunch of individual journeys, but one collective journey that we're taking together. And so this is a scene for me, again, that's stuck in my mind for the last 3 years as I think about this work. But increasingly, as I watch what's happening in the ecosystem, this is becoming true. There are more and more resources that exist that people can leverage. So when we think about what you might do next, right? The first is innovate. We haven't got everything figured out yet, right? There are the nuances of the student, the teacher, the software, and the data, and how they interact that we've still got to keep figuring out. And as we get it figured out, we need to figure out how to make it work for elementary math, for high school math, for ELA, for science, right? So all these specifics of how do we take advantage of leveraging technology to improve education in all those areas. So first would be a request just to keep innovating. The second is be aware of the journey. When I was first starting with this work, so many districts that we talked to said, I just feel like I'm alone. We feel like we're the only people doing this, and so how do we find other people who can help us? I guess my message would be, you're not alone. This is really happening all across the country among nonprofits and state folks and funders, and especially among schools and districts. So I encourage you to find peers and colleagues to work with on this together. The third is to leverage the resources that exist. So there has been a proliferation of implementation guides, toolkits, example videos, and the quality of these resources is getting better and better. So I encourage you to be aware of what's out there. Don't start from scratch. Don't reinvent the wheel from scratch. And once you've looked at the resources, figure out how to customize it for yourself, for your school, for your district, but leverage the resources that exist. And the last is share. Help others find the path. Pause as you make progress to reach down, pick up the rocks, and throw them back so others can see the path so it becomes easier for them. So the last two things I want to close with. The first is a little bit of a reality check. So I was talking with one of my colleagues, John. He is in the Bay Area, where I'm from as well, runs a series of schools that are implementing blended learning. Almost 100% of his students are free and reduced lunch. And as we were talking about the realities of blended learning and what it can do and some of the challenges, we were basically talking about what's realistic to expect for blended learning in schools with such levels of poverty. And one of the things that we don't talk about enough with blended learning is that we have a national poverty problem. We have millions of kids around the country living in poverty, and it ripples through every aspect of their life, including school. And in some ways, the key message that John and I were talking about is blended learning can make a huge difference for a lot of kids and a lot of teachers. I honestly believe it is the transformational education innovation of our time, and it can't solve poverty. And it can't solve so many of these challenges that these children face. And we don't talk about that enough in the blended learning movement. And it's important for us just to recognize that there's so much blended learning can do, but we still need to recognize the challenges of poverty and make sure we're working to try and address those. And then the last piece was just a little bit of inspiration to remind myself and others, why are we doing this work and why is it so important? So I was visiting a school, a district a couple months ago, and they were particularly showing us how they were doing competency-based learning and having kids move at their own pace. And we're talking about their communication plan and talking about how they talked with their parents and community leaders, but also with the teachers and especially the students about what this all meant. And one of the things that they do in their district is students can't go on to high school until they've mastered a specific set of learning objectives in middle school. They're not allowed to go on to the high school. And so they were talking with, again, a lot of groups about this, because they were talking to students, and some of them were really grappling with this. And then one of the students suddenly perked up and said, wait, I get it. What you're saying is you're not going to give up on me. You're not going to let me fail. And when I first heard that, it was just so striking, such powerful words. Because when we think about competency-based learning, so much of it often is enabling kids to move forward at their own pace, to move faster. And once they've got stuff, they can keep going, and they don't need to wait for students who haven't mastered it yet. But there's another piece, which is to make sure students don't have gaps in their learning. And we're not just going to let them move on regardless of whether they've actually learned it. We're going to force them to learn it. And let me clarify that. We are going to make sure as educators that we are going to work with them, and we're going to stick with them and find a way to help them learn. And so as I was showing some of these data dashboards and working with some teachers who were working with it, they said, I'm kind of overwhelmed because I get so much data, and I've got some kids who we keep trying and they keep not mastering it. What do I do? And in the traditional world, you'd say, they've got a C-, you just move them on because there's time to keep going. But in this new world, we'd say, no, we need to find more creative ways to help reach those students to make sure they learn. Right? So we're not going to give up on you. And I think for me, those are just such important words about blended learning and about both why it's important work, but also for me personally and for us as individuals, but also why it's critical for our country and for our kids. So thank you very much. Left. So let me look and see if we've got some questions here. All right. So I'm going to step down here just so I can see the questions. Easier to see on this screen. Okay. So the first question from Scott, really around organizing the data into a useful snapshot. So I think this is where so much of the work of innovation and tools is going to be required. I think the answer for right now is we don't know yet. And I think this is where we need more companies to be focusing on this problem to say, both how do I get the information in an efficient manner, but also how do I get the data from multiple systems? And I think this is one where I'm worried about that. I think we're talking with organizations around open data standards and the opportunity for people increasingly to provide the data in a way that it can be shared and it can be leveraged so that teachers can see all the data at once. But I would say we don't know the answer to this one yet. I think companies are getting better at it, but I'm still struggling to see examples where they integrate data from multiple systems. And I think this is a big challenge that we've got to work on. And I think this is in that bucket of the ecosystem problem solving. This is an issue that lives in that ecosystem problem solving bucket. I think it's a big challenge. So talking about innovations and blended learning for social emotional learning, for non-cognitive skills, et cetera. So I think, again, a critical area, when I talked about the specific, discrete, and demonstrable learning objectives, I think it applies not just to math and science and ELA, but as we think about what we want students to know or be able to do, I think it also applies to these social emotional skills or non-cognitive skills as well. I think we need to be just as specific about the learning objectives in those areas as we are in multiplication. So if we think teamwork is a critical skill, if we think demonstrating advocacy or self-agency is a critical skill, then we need to break down what do those skills mean. So an example that I give sometimes is I studied negotiations. And I think this is very useful stuff, right? Understanding what does it mean to anchor and adjust? What is a BATNA, right? How do you figure out what your alternative is so you know what you're doing when you go into a negotiation? I think this is great information for, a 6th grader, a 7th grader to have. This is a very useful skill. I only learned it my 2nd year of business school, and it was an elective, right? We don't even teach negotiations. And so as we think about the social emotional skills, I think what we need to do is be just as specific about what they mean and what the learning objectives are, and then apply the same concepts around competency-based learning to those skills that we're talking about for others. Oh, I can see here. Good, here we go. What does self-assessment and reflection role play? So I think this is an example of something that we need to think about how to incorporate as we get more and more examples of effective practice. So when we talk about what role do students play with self-assessment and reflection, as we're getting clearer about the data that teachers and students are able to have to be able to see at any point in time where they are in their learning, the question then becomes, how do teachers and students use that information? And I think this is an area where we need to have more examples and find out. In the work that I described, when we're looking at how the teaching and learning happen in the classroom and how to kind of clarify this, part of what we're looking for is examples of effective teaching practice. So once you have specific, discrete, demonstrable learning objectives, you've got the data about student mastery, the whole purpose of having that information is to say, how do I help more students learn more effectively and faster? And then it's going to be questions like, do we have the students drive a lot of that? Because now they've got better access to information, they can drive it. And a lot of it's about the sort of self-assessment and reflection. Or is it primarily the teacher having better information about where students are and being able to provide more targeted support using a broader range of resources? Those are things that we don't have the answers to yet. This is, I think, where we need the ongoing innovation to happen. Because I think they're going to play a critical role. And just like teachers having more information will be valuable, maybe even more so for students, but we need to have more educators trying it so we can find out. What if the demonstration is a collective or a group effort? So a great question. One of the things we've seen is people are doing assessment for multiple learning objectives at once, right? So it can be much more efficient. You can also have an assessment for multiple students at once. So again, in theory, it could be much more efficient. I think we need to keep having the clarity, which is, as an educator, what is I want students to know or be able to do? If they're doing a group project for an assessment, can I actually see each individual student's performance? Does it give me the information I need to be able to determine whether they've mastered it and whether they can move on? And so I think it absolutely can work if it's a group project, as long as an educator, you know what learning objective the students are trying to demonstrate, and you can tell through that group project whether or not each of the students has been effective. How do you communicate or address change in an environment where they've been successful with what they've done before? So we've never run into this problem. It's really not an issue. No, just kidding. One of the things that we've done so far, and I think this also links to the idea of the journey of innovation, is you don't start the journey of innovation with your most resistant groups or groups who are not interested. Really starting with people who are excited about change, who are excited about trying to implement these new ways of working. And so I think there's one piece, which is starting with people who really are excited about doing this work. The second is Michael Horn and Clay Christensen have done a lot of work on what they call the theories of disruptive innovation. And it means one thing very specific, which is you've got to start with folks who don't have a solution that really works great for them today. Because if people either have a great solution or think they have a great solution, they don't have much incentive to try something different. And so sometimes what you do is you start with others who don't have a great solution yet. And as you do, your new innovative solution gets better and better and better until one day your new innovative solution actually is better than what everybody else has. And then the market tips. And so I think a lot of what I would recommend would be to start with people who really want and embrace the change. Because otherwise, I think, especially for something that's innovative, it's really a tough push to convince people who are really pleased with what they've had for the last 20 years. The top 3 challenges and barriers to scale right now. So I think the biggest one that I'm worried about are the tools and the data structures to enable the competency-based learning. So that being able to see that dashboard so I can click and see where students are so that then I know what to do. I think we've got more and better data, especially from individual software programs, but I worry about that data. So that's the biggest concern I have, is those tools and those data for competency-based learning. I think the second one is continuing to push on the human capital and the professional development piece. So we've got more and better resources for teachers certainly than we had before. So we've got videos that are examples for them. We've got curricula that are being developed for PD. I think we need to keep pushing for more and better resources for educators. And then the last one, I mean, candidly, I'm still worried about internet connectivity. We're making a lot of progress, but we still have probably close to 20 million kids in this country who don't have sufficient connectivity. And so on one hand, I know it's not about technology. I know that's not the sexy stuff, and that's not what this is about. But if we're in a world where you simply don't have kids who can get online, and particularly who cannot get online at home, then you've got fundamental equity issues. And so I think enabling students to have access in school, but also significantly at home, is a key barrier. And so I'm very concerned about that one. And what are the principal issues in motivation for blended learning? Well, I guess I just sort of say, speaking for myself, so the very best idea that I have for trying to transform American education is to fundamentally elevate the teaching profession. Right? There's so much evidence that shows that the single most important school-based factor for learning is the teacher. The second most important is the principal. We've got international examples that show, like, what does it look like to elevate the status of your profession and make sure you've got people who are really competing with each other so that there are very few teaching positions and everyone wants them, and continuing to drive that dynamic so we've got teachers who are feeling valued and supported. This is America. And my personal belief is, a lot of times the way we show people we value them is we pay them more. And so I personally think that what we should be doing is dramatically increasing compensation for educators and hiring more educators, because I've never met a private school that said that their value proposition was, we have really big classes. But I've done the math, and that costs $250 billion a year. So I would say, of course we should do that. That's a great national investment. Everyone talks about education being the silver bullet, being the great equalizer. Of course we should do that. I don't think it's going to happen. Or if it is, it's not something that I can help drive. The next best idea I have is technology transformation. And when I see blended learning and the potential it brings for personalizing learning, making it competency-based, and using real-time data, it's the best idea I have. And I think just like we see iPhones and cell phones all across the country, I think we can eliminate the barriers for scale for blended learning and make it also possible for every teacher in the country. So thank you very much.